Compt, The Comeback Kid, a novel by Bill Kearney. Chapter 1. I got out of bed and walked over to the window. I looked out and took a deep breath. Snow covered the hotel grounds. A cool wind swept across the parking lot, blowing the snow around. It made me shiver slightly. I had a good night's sleep without any of those pestering nightmares. Hopefully I'll get through the rest of the day without any headaches. I stepped back from the chilly scene and smiled to myself while thinking, somehow, I'm still alive. Now, if I play my cards right, this time, after being thrown under the bus by both political parties over the last 20 years, I just might get my monthly statement safeguard put in all these dens of inequity. I joined Director Reverend Tom Green and members of his organization that's based right here in Washington, D.C. for breakfast. While there, we discussed our testimonies for the hearing that we're about to enter in the FTC, Federal Trade Commission headquarters. It didn't take long, and I wasn't surprised that after all these years they still have no idea how this so-called entertainment venue that is operating 24/7 in 44 states with absolutely no consumer protection works. Most of them are evangelicals from the Bible Belt states. They're church-going people who don't participate in this form of entertainment. They believe the duty of politics is to establish justice in a sinful world. Evangelicals thinking like that is good for them and for me. Here's why. Things have changed drastically since Laurent first ran for our 45th president. Back then, one of the biggest questions he faced was whether he could win over evangelical Christians. How could he, with him being a casino owner who dated playmates from the Playboy Mansion and was on his third marriage? The only thing he ever preached was the gospel of wealth and power. He needed evangelicals back then, and somehow he got them to hold their noses and vote for him. Things have changed since he became president. Now evangelical support is no longer a question. In fact, President Laurent is so popular with evangelical leaders they have come to think of him as a kind of messiah, the leader they've been waiting for. It was back in 2007 when Reverend Tom first heard about my monthly statements legislation and how I got Laurent way before he was president to say he'd mail them out quarterly if he gets a license to steal in Pennsylvania. He called me and invited me to speak at one of his organization's conferences being held in Pittsburgh, PA. He told me he set up a sit-down with the editorial department of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette when the conference is over. I asked him if they knew I was coming. He said yes. Then he asked me if that's a problem. I told him that I tried to get them to do a story on my monthly statement House bill when it was up for a vote in our House of Representatives, but they refused to. I got in a heated exchange with the head of their editorial department and her staff a few times. They, like many other media outlets, stopped taking my calls. I spent over an hour speaking and taking questions at the conference that day. I brought up my monthly statements along with my other safeguards that addresses the provisions our lawmakers sanctioned in order for them to seduce their prey. I wasn't sure they even understood what I was talking about, but Reverend Tom did. Reverend Tom and I walked into the meeting at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette late that afternoon. We entered a large room with half-glass panel walls. Through them you could see rows and rows of cubicles. Writers and reporters are at their desks on phones and computers. We took seats at a long table with a Catholic Church Monsignor, a pastor from an African American church, and the chief rabbi from a synagogue in Pittsburgh. On the other side of the table sits the head of the editorial department and her staff. After the religious leaders gave their reasons of why they were there, which had little to do with how these facilities operate, I asked the head editor why she didn't support my monthly statements legislation when it was up for a vote. After she gave some half-ass excuse about there being no proof that they were going to help anyone, I laid into her for being more interested in the advertising money they're going to get from this scam than she is the health and well-being of the citizens of her city. Before she gave her rebuttal, I told her when the crime, suicides, and families are destroyed, her and her newspaper will be held accountable. She got up from the table and said, "This meeting is over." She starts walking out and her staff follows her. Before she got to the door, I stood up from the table and out loud told her she's just another pimp for this plague that people like her brought upon us. She turns around, starts hollering at me, and I'm hollering back. Then she starts crying. I told her to save her crocodile tears for the casualties she's going to help them produce. Security guards escort me and the holy rollers out of the building. The Monsignor, pastor, and rabbi were bitching about that, but Reverend Tom didn't say a word. Once outside of the building, Reverend Tom told me it was the first time he ever got escorted out of a meeting by security guards. I was about to apologize, but before I could, he thanked me for doing what he expected me to do. I asked what he meant by that. He He told me my reputation of being a disruptor and somewhat of a bully, but in a good way, is enlightening others of the negative effects this industry is having on individuals and the local economy. I told him his friends he brought with him weren't happy, but that's okay. I never could get any help from religious leaders. They've been MIA, missing in action from day one. But that's going to change once they see their donations and Sunday collections diminishing. Even though we were from two different worlds, Reverend Tom coming from a religious background, and me being somewhat of an atheist, we became good friends. We had some intense conversations over the years with his belief in a creator, and my believing it's all made-up stories in order to keep the flock in place. But when it came to this vice, and especially after the mass shooting, we both agree on one thing. It's time to stop the breeding. That's why we're here today testifying in front of the FTC, Federal Trade Commission. Reverend Tom and his organization have been trying for years to get the FTC, whose mission is protecting the public from deceptive or unfair business practices, to investigate the flaws in the laws that govern this so-called entertainment industry. But their Washington lobbyists kept shutting it down. The only reason it's happening now and why I'm here is because of the mass shooting. We went into the hearing and took our seats at the table with microphones on them. After we were sworn in, we gave our opening statements. Then the testifying and questioning began. Reverend Tom mostly focused on immorality and social issues. I went right for the throat like I always do. I presented factual evidence that proves these facilities that are now doing business over the internet are operating with no consumer protection. I listed the provisions that lawmakers sanctioned in order for them to fill state tax coffers. I brought up my safeguards that address the deceptive business practices they're using that are unfair and harmful to consumers. Things like how they're cashing personal checks and offering interest-free credit. I explained how this industry is operating under the Treasury's Bank Security Act. So I asked if that would mean the feds would be able to make them mail monthly statements to their patrons. The chairperson couldn't answer that, but she did say she'd definitely look into it. I was making some headway with my safeguards, especially the monthly statements, one which the chairperson and her staff all agreed that it makes sense being these facilities already have in place a system that is tracking their patrons' money expenditures. The hearing lasted over 4 hours. I ended my testimony by saying this industry is operating like amusement parks without any safety belts or cages on their rides. Afterwards, Reverend Tom and I spent some time with the woman who is the new chairperson of the Federal Trade Commission. She said our testimonies were an eye-opener, and she is going to have her staff look further into my safeguards, especially the monthly statements one. Before leaving the hearing, Reverend Tom asked me if I had time to come out to his hometown in Omaha, Nebraska for a couple days to speak at town hall meeting in their capital. He said his childhood friend, who just so happens to be the CEO of a multinational conglomerate company and he's worth over $100 billion, will be there. He told me his friend had a lot to do with keeping them out of Nebraska, but the tide has changed. And it looks like by this time next year, Nebraska will become the 45th state legalizing this scam. You would think with his friend's kind of money you could stop this from ever happening. But his friend's money isn't filling Nebraska tax coffers like this scam will. And that's what matters. I took up Reverend Tom's offer and we caught a 3-hour flight to Omaha later that evening. We boarded the plane. I had the window seat and Reverend Tom sat next to me with his Bible in hand. I got on my cell phone to check my phone and text messages. He did the same. When we were done, he told me that his billionaire friend texted him and said he can't wait to meet me. In most people's worlds, a billionaire wanting to meet them would be something special, but for me it's just another day in La La Land. But I was curious to hear how Reverend Tom and he became friends. So I asked him how that happened. Before he could tell me, the plane prepares to take off. When it did, I looked out the window and on it I could see Reverend Tom's reflection. He was holding his Bible and praying to himself. Once the plane was airborne, we talked about his billionaire friend. Reverend Tom and his friend's family were cattle ranchers going back to when William F. Buffalo Bill Cody officially started his Wild West show in 1883. His friend's family ranch was twice the size of Reverend Tom's family's. They were competitors with one another, but they were good friends. There were many marriages between the families. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, his friend's family bailed Reverend Tom's family out from losing everything. Reverend Tom inherited the ranch in the late 60s when he was attending a Baptist seminary. He had no interest in ranching, so he sold it to his friend, who lets him live in the house where he was born in and raised his family. He talked more about his childhood life. To me, it sounded like Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. When he finished, he got up to use the bathroom. Before he did, he said when he gets back, he wants to hear my childhood story. As he headed to the bathroom, I'm thinking, my childhood? I didn't have time for one. Ever since I can remember, the whole idea was to grow up, and that's exactly what I did in a mostly all-Catholic working-class neighborhood in Northeast Philadelphia, 4 city blocks from St. Martin's Parish.